across in this entrance right section, is that migration is not only a sign of the times, but really is, as some scholars say, it is the age of migration. It's the most important issue that we're facing today. And right now, these numbers could go up to 450 million within the next 40 years. All right, so this issue is going to continue to be with us regardless of what policies that we come up with. It's going to affect absolutely every area of human life, which is the reason why scholars from every different discipline are taking up this issue. It is, as I've said, some call it the age of migration. But it is also a difficult issue. And so as we move into this second territory, which is really, as I'd say, the conceptual territory, much where the way people think about this issue, I want to just say two things in this part. The first is that migration is an incredibly complex issue. And if people don't realize that, they're not listening or they don't understand. The second thing I'd like to say is migration is an incredibly simple issue. And if people do not realize that, they're not listening or they don't understand. All right? And so really, that's true. And I can just give you an example of what that's like. Most of the time, I didn't actually go out looking for this issue. Somehow this issue found me. And it found me by living in Latin America, but also working with migrants in parishes, hearing their stories, and somehow those really claimed me on a fundamental level. But I remember doing some research, and I've been working both with the Border Patrol in the United States and in Europe and a number of constituencies. But I remember one time when I was working with the Border Patrol in southern Arizona, and I would do what's called ride-alongs with them. And sometimes I'd go out with them on a search and rescue patrol. Sometimes I'd go out in helicopters to understand the terrain. Sometimes I'd go out on just their normal kind of duties as they would patrol the border. And one time, I remember we were down in southern Arizona. And so right at the area where the fence it meets up at Mexico and the United States, this one Border Patrol agent was hosting me that day, and he was just explaining to me some of the things he did on a normal basis. And so he said, you know, one time I was driving through this area, he's recounting this story, and he said a group of aliens came across, the terms that he used. And so he said, you know, when I went after them, and I would say 98% of the people are hardworking people looking for jobs, the place where the targeted and legal enforcement mechanisms need to be addressed is the increasingly dark and difficult and dangerous territory of the drugs and the cartels. Lots of money being made and lots of violence. But this was one moment when they were smuggling some drugs across the border. And so this Border Patrol agent said that when he saw them, he went after them, but they turned around and they had machine guns and they started firing them upon him. So he says, I remember hitting the deck, and he said, I was scared to death. He said, it was so traumatic that I had to go to counseling for a long time afterwards. He said, it affected my relationships, and then I'd wake up with nightmares every night. And it was in the course of that suddenly like something opened up with me, and I thought, oh my gosh, I never knew a Border Patrol agent had to go through all of that. And so he was sharing me more about his life throughout the day, and maybe 3 hours later, we were driving along another part of the border. And so I was asking him, I said, you know, how do you know which vehicles to stop? And so he said, well, you know, they're usually weighted a certain way, and he kind of gave me a couple descriptors. And it was no more than 2 minutes after I asked the question that this vehicle passed. And suddenly, you know, he realized that he had to make a quick move. He turned around the vehicle, he turned on his lights, and then he went in hot pursuit of this vehicle. And within a moment, suddenly there was this big cloud of dust, and then all of a sudden I saw these migrants just run out of the vehicle and go in every direction. Now, what was very interesting at that moment was my reaction. Because I was so much in the mind of the Border Patrol agent at that moment that my first reaction was, oh, I hope he gets them. And then I thought about all the stories of the migrants over the years that are looking for a better life, and then I thought, oh, no, I hope they get away, run, you know? And so suddenly it was a different kind of border that I was on. And so I thought, you know, the scholarly part of me said, you know, somehow I've got to really listen more deeply to the different players in the immigration debate and find the legitimacy of each one of the arguments, and only then be able to assess them. But I knew I had to register this. So let me just map out to you what I think are 6 positions along the border. And I would maintain that so far in my research, I could see this holding historically, that you can see similar groups that can be mapped out archetypally, and what's really happened if we were to transplant ourselves 100 years ago and what happened to the Irish or the Chinese or others. But also I see this happening internationally. I see similar groups under different names, but with similar dynamics and methods and similar perspectives also coming up. So let me just map out these perspectives. All right. The first group on the far end are vigilante groups. And these are the groups that Lou Dobbs would always love to bring on his show. And these are groups kind of very patriotic, very nationalistic. But they're saying, look, we're trying to protect personal property along the border. And we're trying to hear what the ranchers are saying. And their property is getting trashed. And migrants that are coming are at least a nuisance, but sometimes dangerous. And we're trying to prevent unlawful entry and to fill in the gaps where federal enforcement fails. All right, so they're concerned citizens doing civic duty, but they're not deputized or authorized by the federal government. The next group is the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, Immigration, Customs and Enforcement. And their job is to enforce policy. Right? They're saying, like, we don't make the laws, but we actually have to enforce the laws. So this is like the Border Patrol. And they're trying to ensure order and prevent entry of unlawful agents, especially of foreign invaders who could harm its citizens. Yesterday I was in New York City. We had a briefing with the Council on Foreign Affairs on the different types of terrorist methods that they've had to deal with since 9/11, and including 9/11, and it is mind-boggling and it is a legitimate concern. But this group is saying, look, we have a right to protect borders and we have a right to protect citizens, and somehow we have to make up legal systems that do that. These have changed, the laws have changed over time, but there is a legitimate need for that. The third are political leaders, and their job is to create federal policy. All right, this is where it begins to thicken. To protect the citizens of a country and to manage its resources. So they say, look, we can't let in everybody. If we did, it would flood the infrastructure and it would be detrimental to the common good. But we've got to make some distinctions about who we can allow in and under what criteria we allow them in. And when my ancestors first came into this country, the policy was we let in almost everybody. But we do make some exceptions. So if you were a terrorist, if you were an anarchist, or if you had certain diseases, you could be turned away at Ellis Island. But now the policy is pretty much we let in nobody, but we make some exceptions. All right, so if you have a specialized skill, or if you marry an American, or if your life is in danger, under very strict criteria can you be allowed to enter the United States. So these policies do change over time quite a bit. But whatever it is, this group is entrusted with really making the laws that regulate that entry. The next group are corporations. And we see corporations continuing to enter into the immigration fray because on the top end you have groups like Microsoft or Sun Microsystems and other computer software engineers that are saying, look, we need a lot of the folks coming from India or China or other places to really advance and become competitive in the global marketplace. All right? All right. But also it's interesting when corporations study this, some reports are really will point out the net drain that immigrants are on an economy, but there are equally compelling and even more persuasive studies that look at immigrants that create jobs, right? So we're looking at eBay, Sun Microsystems, Google, Intel. All these were started by immigrants, right? They've created hundreds of thousands of jobs. At the lower end, though, we see kind of places like in the agriculture industry and the construction, certainly where there is not enough labor to meet the needs. So there are crops that are going to waste in California, in Oregon, in Washington State, in Arizona, in North Carolina, in Alabama, and other places, simply because there's not enough people to help meet the demands that are there. The next group are church leaders. Very vocal on this. I think the Catholic Church has been particularly good on this. And really just holding to a basic vision, which is to proclaim a God of life, to protect the rights of human beings who are made in God's image and likeness. And as Pope Paul VI said, the mission of the Church is fundamentally to proclaim, to build a civilization of love. So it's to denounce injustice and it's to announce the reign of God. And lastly here are human rights advocates in a similar vein are trying to protect the rights of immigrants, to prevent the exploitation of the vulnerable, and to fight for human dignity. All right. So more or less, these positions can map out in different ways, and I think it's very important to understand that people who are fighting and might see things very differently are not bad people. I mean, demonizing people is certainly very prevalent in this field, but I think that there are legitimate claims that people come up. But the reason why some of the debate begins to get so heated is because underneath these positions are certain rights that are going to be fought for. This group here is going to fight for property rights. Primarily sometimes individual property rights, this is mine, not yours. Sometimes it's sovereign rights, this is our country, don't invade it. This group here is really going to emphasize sovereign rights, and that is the right of a nation to protect its borders, all right, which even Catholic social teaching recognizes, though in a qualified way. It doesn't see it as an absolute right, but it does see it as a legitimate right. Thirdly are cultural rights. And here the decision about what does it mean to be an American become particularly dicey, especially in light of our own country, where we've had Chinese exclusionary acts, where we've put the Japanese in internment camps, and where we've systematically excluded other groups when they didn't fit our criteria of what we think an American looks like. This group here is going to emphasize economic rights, especially allowing the free market to exercise its due course. This group here is going to look at principally natural rights, that is those given by God. And this group here is going to emphasize classically and philosophically what is considered human rights. So this is where the fray begins to thicken, and this is really when it begins to amp up the debate. But it's going to really fall out along three policy lines. This group here is going to say enforcement, right? And this is currently where we are in the United States. So the policy will be close down the borders, keep them out, protect what we have. This group here is going to really say, let's look if we can have some kind of guest worker program. They need the work and we need the workers. Let's create a legal system to allow people to move back and forth. This is where, the first is where we currently are. The second was where the middle ground is, where there's tried to be brokering new legislation which has failed, even though it we have had guest worker programs in the past, but currently we've not been able to prove one. And then this third group is going to look towards issues of at least an open door to an earned path to citizenship. And let me just say this, the Catholic Church does not emphasize completely open borders. It doesn't. But it does say that somehow there should be at least the path towards earned citizenship. That should be a provision in there, provided people meet certain criteria. So more or less, these are going to be political lines that are going to begin to fall out. But here is really where things begin to separate from each other. And it begins with language. So again, my main kind of focus tonight is to look at this in terms of trying to get a new imagination about migration. And that imagination is stitched together by language and words. And those of you who are familiar with literary studies or gender studies or linguistic studies know that language shapes a reality, you know, and the reality around space or who the other is very, very important in this debate. This group here sees them as aliens. This is the official language that's used by the U.S. government currently. They're aliens, right? All right, and yet to say this begins to create a reality that can be very dehumanizing, right? Now, to give you even an example, a colleague of mine married somebody from Canada. And he says, you know, it was very striking to me, he said, when I went to the immigration hearing with my wife, because the immigration officer, you know, looked at me and then looked at my wife and looked at me again, and he said, so how long have you known the alien? So the actual kind of impression of this, I think, really left him cold. All right, and but really, really beneath that, these are questions being debated within the Supreme Court right now. Certainly, we had the beginning of this in the Arizona legislation. This will continue. When people cross borders without documents, what kind of rights do they have? Are they rights given by God and cannot be alienated in any way, literally? Or are they rights that simply are granted by and insured by a country, and therefore, what are the implications of that for a country like our own? All right. This next group here is going to see them as workers. And so it really is an economic question. So it's saying, like, is this a net gain or a net drain on our economy? All right? Are they going to add something or going to take something from us? All right? And to be honest on that, the best literature on this is really going to put that about even. For every argument saying that they're draining resources, they're consumers, they are paying taxes, they are doing work that no one else wants to do. And so there's various things that are done on either side. But really, whatever this kind of category, this group is really going to line up these debates, certainly along economic lines. This third group here, though, and this is not rocket science, but this is the most fundamental, is finally say, look, these are people. And if these are human beings that really are made in the image and likeness of God, this really makes a very different set of moral demands on us than if they're workers that can be just dispensed of or people dying in the desert that shouldn't have been here to begin with. But it's a very, very different set of moral claims. And 90% of really what I'm speaking about tonight, and really 90% of a theological perspective on migration, is trying to get the human face of the migrant right. Because if we can't get that piece right, really nothing else is going to fall together. I mean, and if it's just that, they broke laws and therefore shouldn't be here, really that's a whole different thing, which brings me to my next point, because this tends to be the most controversial sort of perspective on it, which is the legal philosophies. Now, if this is a question of yours, I can open it up now, but probably when I give talks on this, probably the most common question, pushback question I get more than any other, with various levels of aggressiveness, is some variant of this one, which is, Father, which part of illegal don't you understand? They broke the laws, they shouldn't be here, they need to be deported, case closed. What's the problem? And these are by very educated people often that are very smart in other areas of life. The problem with the perspective is it has nothing to do with reality. Because really, even from a legal perspective, it's very inadequate. Because it limits law to just an understanding of the civil ordinance. And what do I mean by that? And this is where theology can add something. Thomas Aquinas said we have 4 laws. We have natural laws. In this case, parents need to feed their families. We have civil laws by which societies need to organize themselves for the common good. We have divine laws which we know through Scripture about feeding the hungry and the thirsty and the naked and the sick and the imprisoned and the estranged. But we have divine laws through which God keeps the universe in motion. What Aquinas said is that what brings justice is to bring some sort of connection and harmony and participation between those laws. But when you have laws that are set up that are at variance with each other, then you have the disorder and the discord and the injustice that we currently have. And so immigration reform is not based on breaking laws. It's not about supporting people who cross borders without papers as saying this is ideal. It's about saying we have not attended to the more fundamental laws that are really at stake. Because why we have these economic disparities, it doesn't matter how big a wall we build. People will continue to come across borders looking for work and dignity and help. And so it's often said that if we build a 20-foot wall, there will be a 21-foot ladder. And there's no question in my mind that the difference is that to what kind of human cost will there be when that takes place. All right, now, this group here is going to emphasize the civil laws. And the argument's going to go something like this. What, are you crazy? I mean, they're going to take away our culture. I mean, they're going to ruin our way of life. They're going to make us eat salsa all the time, for crying out loud. All right? So there's some kind of deep-seated fear here. And the person who really helped me the most to understand this, and he's a fellow Catholic, Pat Buchanan, I really thank him incredibly because of the actual quote soundbite he gave me. And he said this with a straight face. He said the real problem with immigrants today is that they're taking away, quote, Native American culture. Right? All right? So really, as we know, even Boston's own Samuel Huntington, talked about, Harvard's own talked about really kind of this white flight threat and really this kind of receding of the American dominating white Anglo-Saxon culture. But it really, white European American culture has become the dominant frame, but it really is a question of how do we see ourselves as Americans, what is our identity? Even from the founding forefathers of this country, it's very clear that all men were created equal, right? As long as they were white, right? And it's very interesting to see that the same creed, though, has brought us back to revise that again and again. And this is why Martin Luther King Jr., even from a Birmingham jail, when he really was looking at Aquinas' law, he says that any law, like segregation, which discriminates, is a violence against the natural law and the eternal law and the divine law. And so really, his basis was not really to do law breaking, but it's to call really to a deeper law through which only then can we have a just and peaceful society. This group is going to emphasize economic laws, which is really an appeal to what Adam Smith talked about as the invisible hand. Right? So the question is, well, let's let the economic system work this out. Right? The problem with that, and I would argue this, is that when we have globalization, it's uprooting a lot of traditional moorings of society particularly religious moorings, we are vulnerable to moving from a society grounded on monotheism to one grounded on money-theism. All right? And by that, I mean that what the scriptures remind us of is that the great temptation of human life is not atheism. All right? It's not believing in God. It's idolatry. It's making false gods. All right? And so we might ask ourselves, what are the gods, all right, that we will worship at any cost, all right, even at great human expense? All right? So, but this group here is certainly going to emphasize the economic dimensions of this, which have a role, but actually tend to be absolutized by some. But this group here is going to emphasize the natural laws, which is an appeal to what the United Nations referred to as the invisible heart. So, and this is extraordinary. I mean, the United Nations, very secular in its own orientation, is saying, basically, what's the main question of human life? Right? How do we find a way to get along and to connect with each other? All right? And this has very deep theological ramifications, in my opinion. All right? And so this whole notion, and I would say that discipleship ultimately is about making visible the invisible heart of God. All right? So really, that just brings us down. Let me summarize this second part in two ways, and that is really first by looking at the main question here. Which really, what is at stake here is saying, who is the other? Right? Who is that person who is different from who I am? Right? And on the most local level, this may be somebody in my family. All right? But in kind of a more extended sense, this actually is dealing into other groups, and in this case, the immigrants who may be coming from different places. So this group is going to calculate it in terms of the fear of the other, this group in terms of the usefulness of the other, this group here in terms of the connection to the other. All right? So migrating between these spaces really isn't just a political issue. This becomes very important because it's a psychological and a spiritual issue as well, which I'll get into in a moment. But where this leaves us, it leads us not just to geographical borders on the issue of migration. As we go deeper into it, we find ourselves on conceptual borders. And I would summarize this by saying it's a border between sovereign rights and human rights, a border between civil law and natural law, a border between national security and human insecurity. And I would emphasize that unless the issues of human insecurity are dealt with, it doesn't matter how big a wall or how big a military we have, we will continue to have people who are looking for ways of remedying hunger and excessive poverty and vulnerability. And finally, it's looking at the issues of citizenship and discipleship. All right, and saying, what does it mean to fulfill my duties and expectations of being a member of the state, but also what does it mean to challenge those who profess faith in Christ to respond to the inclusive demands of the gospel? Right? So very important questions. And we have to move beyond a dualist mind on this. Right? This is not one's better, one's worse. Both of these need to happen. And somehow we have to move towards some greater synthesis because that what's happening is that we're getting isolated within our own walls and we're never able to move beyond them. So this third part in the liturgy of the Eucharist, let me go into the sort of theological and spiritual territory. All right, and let me again begin with just a story that happened to me when I was growing up. I think I was about 8 years old, and my family was on a road trip that we were visiting some relatives in the Northeast. And I can remember we stopped at a rest area along the way. And I remember when we went into the rest area, there was a pamphlet on the ground that had a title which I never forgot. And it was just a provocative question that said, did you know that you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches? Right? That you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches. And I don't know if it was then that I wanted to be a theologian. And I look back, and the inside of the pamphlet, the theology was absolutely terrible. But the actual question always stayed with me. And it went on to say that actually the distance between the head and the heart in most people is only 18 inches. And that God was not just an intellectual concept to understand, but a relationship to enter into in the depths of one's being. And that if one could not migrate that 18 inches, one would never really know what it means to be Christian. Now, what the Native Americans say, and I would say it here, is that the long migration of human life is the journey between the head and the heart and then back to the head again. And I would contend that the walls and the borders that exist between that road are more obstinate and difficult to overcross than any of those along borders of nation states. And so really what we are talking about here is the area of spirituality, right? And so what do we mean by spirituality? I spent 5 years studying this systematically, and at the end of the 5 years I understood less than when I started it. But I'd have to say that one thing that did come through was that somehow spirituality is related in its most general sense. I'm talking about Hindu, Buddhist, agnostic, Catholic, any spirituality we're talking, somehow is connected to the values that are most important to us. And that somehow those, regardless of how we phrase it, somehow that stuff is really key to us. It's the deepest part of our hearts. What's most core to us and dear to us? That's what we're living for. But Christian spirituality is really something more specific, which is living out what Christ values. Right? Now, what did Christ value? What was the thing that Christ valued the most? Right? All right, he didn't just come to establish church buildings, and he didn't just come to establish a church leadership, but he actually came primarily to proclaim the kingdom of God. All right, so that's relativized everything else, is that the kingdom with God reigning in the human heart through love was the fundamental basis of Jesus' whole message, his preaching, his teaching, his vision, everything he taught about. Everything has to do with the kingdom of God. And so that kingdom, as Vatican II says, is a kingdom of truth and life, of holiness and grace, of justice, of love, and of peace. Right? That is the whole core of the gospel right there. Now, what's interesting is that Christ's call to follow him is also a migration. And that migrating with Christ can be understood in terms of this fundamental pilgrimage of human life. So if life itself is a migration, and that the Christian journey is itself a migration, it's a very key issue spiritually and theologically, and not just economically and socially. And where that brings us to is saying, let's look back at both of these sides and what's happening with migration today in the world, what's happening in the church throughout history, and say, what are some of the connecting points here? And this kind of last section here is I want to really frame in light of a story that happened to me between the borders of Morocco and Spain. So Morocco and Spain are kind of a similar corridor to what's happening in our American Southwest. Thousands of people are dying in this area in the same way that they're dying crossing the American Southwest. And I went into this